In the heart of the city, where towering skyscrapers reflect the brilliance of the sun and the streets are alive with the hustle and bustle of people, there exists a stark contrast between wealth and poverty. Among the crowds of sharply dressed businessmen, hurried professionals, and tourists snapping photos, a man named Marcus sits on the cold, unforgiving pavement. His clothes are tattered, his shoes worn to the sole, and his face weathered from years of hardship. Marcus once had a life filled with promise, but a series of unfortunate events left him with nothing but the streets to call home. On this particular day, the city is as vibrant as ever, with people rushing to their destinations, oblivious to the world around them. Amidst this scene, a sleek black car pulls up in front of one of the most prestigious buildings in the area, a towering symbol of wealth and power. The door opens, and out steps a man who commands attention with his mere presence. His name is Richard Davenport, a self-made millionaire known for his ruthless business tactics and cold demeanor. Dressed in a custom-tailored suit, his every movement exudes confidence and superiority. As Richard strides down the sidewalk, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the pavement, he notices Marcus sitting near the entrance of the building. The sight of a homeless man, dirty and disheveled, sitting so close to his place of business, disgusts him. He slows his pace, his expression turning from one of indifference to one of contempt. Marcus, feeling the weight of the millionaire's gaze, looks up, his tired eyes meeting Richard's piercing stare. Without a second thought, Richard sneers and steps closer, drawing the attention of passers-by. "What are you doing here?" he demands, his voice dripping with disdain. "You don't belong in a place like this. You're an eyesore in front of my building." Marcus, used to being ignored or dismissed, is taken aback by the harshness of the words. He tries to explain himself, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just resting for a moment. I'll move along soon." But Richard is not interested in explanations. He sees Marcus as nothing more than a stain on the pristine image he has worked so hard to create. The onlookers, curious about the commotion, begin to gather, their eyes flicking between the powerful businessman and the homeless man. Sensing an opportunity to further assert his dominance, Richard continues his tirade, his voice rising with each word. "You think you can just sit here, in front of my building, and beg for scraps?" he says, his tone icy. "People like you are the reason this city is going downhill. You're lazy, a drain on society. Why don't you get a job instead of relying on the kindness of others?" The words cut deep, but Marcus remains silent, his gaze fixed on the ground. The crowd watches in uncomfortable silence, some averting their eyes, others looking on with a mixture of pity and disgust. Richard, fueled by his own arrogance, feels a twisted sense of satisfaction as he continues to berate the man in front of him. "Let me make this clear," Richard says, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. "You are not welcome here. If I ever see you in front of my building again, I'll make sure you're removed from this area permanently. Understand?" Marcus nods weakly, not trusting his voice to respond. He gathers what little dignity he has left and begins to rise from the pavement. As he does, Richard smirks, feeling victorious in his public humiliation of the man. Without another word, he turns on his heel and strides into the building, leaving Marcus to the whispers and stares of the crowd. As the doors close behind him, Richard dismisses the encounter from his mind, already shifting his focus back to his business dealings. For him, the exchange was nothing more than an inconvenience, a brief moment of annoyance in his otherwise perfect day. But for Marcus, the humiliation lingers, a painful reminder of the vast chasm between the haves and the have-nots. With a heavy heart, Marcus shuffles away from the building, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He finds a quieter spot in an alley, away from the prying eyes of the public, and sits down to collect himself. The harsh words replay in his mind, each one a blow to his already fragile spirit. But beneath the sadness, there is a flicker of resilience, a quiet strength that has kept him going all these years. As the day turns into night, Marcus reflects on his life, the choices he made, and the circumstances that led him to this point. He knows that the world is not kind to people like him, but he refuses to let this encounter define him. He has faced adversity before, and he will face it again. With a deep breath, he resolves to keep moving forward, no matter how difficult the journey may be. Little does Richard know that this seemingly insignificant encounter will soon come back to haunt him, setting off a chain of events that will change both of their lives forever. The city's rhythm continued to pulse with its usual fervor, but for Marcus, the days after his humiliating encounter with Richard Davenport dragged on with a heavy weight. He avoided the front of the towering building where Richard worked, choosing instead to find solace in the quieter parts of the city, where the lights were dimmer and the people less judgmental. Each step was a reminder of his lowly place in the world, but also a testament to his resilience. He had been through worse and would survive this too. Meanwhile, Richard continued with his life, unbothered by the incident. His business empire was thriving, and his days were filled with meetings, deals, and the endless pursuit of more wealth. He had built his fortune from the ground up, and nothing, especially not a random homeless man, could shake his focus. His life from the outside appeared perfect. A loving family, a luxurious home, and all the trappings of success. But beneath the surface, his relentless ambition often led him to make enemies, and his ruthless nature distanced him from those who once cared for him. One evening, as dusk settled over the city, Marcus found himself wandering the streets, trying to gather his thoughts. The air was crisp, with a slight chill that hinted at the approaching winter. As he passed through a narrow alley, he caught a glimpse of something unusual. In the distance, a thick column of smoke was rising into the sky, illuminated by the eerie orange glow of flames licking at the darkening sky. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the fire was coming from a part of the city he knew all too well, the affluent neighborhood where Richard Davenport lived. The thought of the wealthy businessman in danger didn't stir much sympathy in Marcus. After all, Richard had made it clear what he thought of people like him. But something deep inside him, a sense of moral duty that no amount of hardship could erode, urged him to head toward the fire. As he got closer, the scene before him became more chaotic. People were gathering, drawn by the flames that now roared hungrily, consuming everything in their path. Firefighters battled valiantly against the blaze, their shouts and the sound of water hoses barely audible over the crackling of wood and the shattering of glass. The heat was intense, even from a distance, and the air was thick with smoke that stung Marcus's eyes and filled his lungs. The mansion at the center of the inferno was unmistakably Richard's. Its grand architecture, once a symbol of wealth and status, was now being devoured by the flames. Marcus could see the desperation in the eyes of the firefighters and the bystanders who watched helplessly as the fire raged on. He overheard snippets of frantic conversations. Richard had been away on business, but his family was home. His wife and young daughter were supposed to be inside. Without a second thought, Marcus pushed his way through the crowd, moving closer to the burning house. The fire had spread rapidly, and it was clear that anyone still inside would have little chance of survival. He heard someone scream that the firefighters couldn't reach the upper floors, where the child's room was located. It was too dangerous. The stairs had collapsed, and the flames were too fierce. In that moment, time seemed to slow down for Marcus. His mind raced as he remembered the look of pure disdain Richard had given him just days before. Yet as much as he wanted to walk away, to let fate run its course, he couldn't shake the image of a terrified child trapped inside a burning building. He knew that if he turned his back now, he would never be able to live with himself. Driven by an instinct he didn't fully understand, Marcus ran toward the house. People shouted at him to stop, that it was suicide to go in there, but he ignored them. His only thought was to get to the child, to save her if he could. As he approached the entrance, the heat became almost unbearable, the fire's roar deafening. The front door had been blown open by the force of the fire, and through the smoke, Marcus could see the burning remains of what had once been a grand foyer. He hesitated for only a second before plunging into the inferno. The heat was like a wall, searing his skin and making it difficult to breathe. He pulled his jacket up to cover his mouth and nose, trying to filter out some of the smoke as he made his way through the house. The flames danced around him, consuming everything in their path. But Marcus pushed forward, guided by a sense of purpose that overpowered his fear. The layout of the house was unfamiliar, but he instinctively knew where to go. He moved toward the back of the house, where he guessed the stairs would be. As he rounded a corner, he saw the staircase, or what was left of it. The lower half was engulfed in flames, but the upper part, though smoldering, was still intact. Without thinking, Marcus grabbed onto the banister and began to climb, the heat scorching his hands. The wood creaked ominously under his weight, threatening to give way at any moment. When he reached the top, the hallway was filled with smoke so thick he could barely see. He dropped to his knees, crawling along the floor to avoid the worst of it. The sound of the fire was overwhelming, but beneath it, he thought he heard something. A faint cry, a child's voice calling for help. The sound spurred him on, giving him the strength to keep moving. He followed the sound to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Marcus could see the flickering light of the flames that were starting to consume the room. He pushed the door open and found himself in what must have been the child's bedroom. The flames had already taken hold of the curtains and part of the bed, but in the far corner, huddled in fear, was a little girl. She was no older than 6, her tear-streaked face pale with terror. Her small frame shook as she cried out for her mother, her voice barely audible over the noise of the fire. When she saw Marcus, her eyes widened in fear, but he quickly held out his hand, trying to reassure her. "It's okay," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "I'm here to help you. We need to get out of here now." The girl hesitated, but something in Marcus's calm demeanor must have convinced her. She slowly reached out, taking his hand. As soon as their fingers touched, Marcus scooped her up into his arms, shielding her as best as he could from the flames. He turned back toward the door, but the fire had spread even further in the short time he had been in the room. The hallway was now a tunnel of fire, and the staircase he had climbed was completely engulfed. Desperation clawed at Marcus's chest as he realized there was no way out through the front of the house. He looked around the room, trying to find another escape route. His eyes landed on the window, and he quickly moved toward it, hoping it wasn't locked. To his relief, it slid open with ease, and he peered out, assessing their chances. They were on the second floor, and the drop was significant, but it was their only option. Holding the girl tightly, Marcus climbed out onto the window ledge. Below, the crowd had noticed them, and shouts of alarm rose up as people pointed toward the window. Marcus took a deep breath, praying for the strength to do what needed to be done. "Hold on tight," he whispered to the girl. "We're going to be okay." With that, he jumped. The air rushed past them as they fell, the ground rushing up to meet them. Marcus twisted his body to take the brunt of the impact, and they hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. Pain shot through him, but he held onto the girl, shielding her as best as he could. For a moment, he lay there, stunned and disoriented, but then he felt the girl stir in his arms. She was alive, and that was all that mattered. Despite the pain, Marcus forced himself to his feet, clutching the girl to his chest as he stumbled away from the burning house. The crowd parted before him, some people reaching out to help, others staring in shock at the man who had risked everything to save a stranger's child. As he moved through the throng, he heard the sound of sirens approaching. The fire department had finally arrived, but it was too late to save the house. The flames had consumed it entirely, and now the firefighters were focused on containing the blaze, preventing it from spreading to the neighboring homes. Marcus kept walking until he found a spot far enough away from the chaos. Gently, he set the girl down, checking her over for injuries. She was shaken and scared, but miraculously unharmed. Relief flooded through him, followed by exhaustion as the adrenaline began to wear off. He sat down beside her, taking a moment to catch his breath. In the distance, he could see the house collapsing in on itself, the flames still roaring. It was a sight he would never forget. But as he looked at the girl beside him, safe and alive, he knew he had done the right thing. No amount of money or power could ever make up for the loss of a life, especially one so young and innocent. As the crowd began to disperse, one figure remained, standing at the edge of the scene. It was Richard Davenport, his face pale and his eyes wide with disbelief. He had arrived just in time to see Marcus and his daughter emerge from the flames, and the sight had shaken him to his core. All his wealth, all his power, had meant nothing in that moment. It had been a man he had humiliated and dismissed who had saved his daughter's life. Richard's mind was reeling as he tried to process what had just happened. He had always prided himself on his strength and self-sufficiency, but in the face of this disaster, he had been helpless. The realization that he owed his daughter's life to a man he had treated so poorly was almost too much to bear. He watched as Marcus, bruised and battered, sat with his daughter, comforting her as the flames continued to rage in the background. For the first time in his life, Richard felt a pang of shame, a deep, gnawing guilt that ate away at the arrogance that had always been his shield. He had spent his life looking down on others, judging them for their failures, their weaknesses. But now, as he looked at Marcus, he realized that true strength wasn't about wealth or power. It was about compassion, bravery, and the willingness to risk everything for someone else. With a heavy heart, Richard began to walk toward them, unsure of what he would say, but knowing that he needed to express the gratitude and remorse that were welling up inside him. He needed to make amends, not just for the sake of his daughter, but for himself. This fire had not just destroyed his home. It had ignited something within him, a spark of understanding that would change his life forever. The flames had finally been subdued, but the damage was done. Richard Davenport's once grand mansion was now a smoldering ruin, its charred skeleton standing as a grim reminder of the night's events. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, mingling with the sounds of firemen packing up their gear and the murmurs of onlookers who had yet to disperse. Marcus sat on a nearby curb, the weight of the night's events settling heavily on his shoulders. His body ached from the impact of the fall, and his lungs burned from the smoke he had inhaled. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He watched as the little girl he had saved was reunited with her mother, their tearful embrace a stark contrast to the cold, indifferent world that had so often turned its back on him. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy and relief. But for Marcus, it was bittersweet. He had done what needed to be done, but now he was back to being just another invisible man in the crowd, forgotten as quickly as he had been noticed. The fire had drawn a crowd, and in that crowd, Marcus could see the faces of the city's wealthy and powerful. People who, like Richard, would never have given him a second glance. He knew that as the night wore on, they would retreat to their homes, their comfortable lives untouched by the devastation that had befallen Richard. But for Marcus, this night would linger in his mind for a long time. It was a reminder of how fragile life was, how easily everything could be taken away. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he was startled by a shadow falling over him. Looking up, he saw Richard Davenport standing before him. The businessman's normally pristine suit was covered in soot, his hair disheveled, and his face etched with lines of exhaustion and something else, something Marcus hadn't seen before. Was it guilt? Humility? Whatever it was clear that the fire had done more than just destroy Richard's home. It had shaken him to his core. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply looked at each other, the tension between them almost palpable. Marcus could see the turmoil in Richard's eyes, the struggle to find the right words. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would Richard offer a perfunctory thank you and leave, eager to distance himself from the man who had saved his daughter? Or would he try to rationalize the situation, offer money or some other form of compensation to ease his conscience? Finally, Richard broke the silence. His voice, usually so confident and commanding, was quiet, almost hesitant. "I don't even know where to begin," he said, his gaze dropping to the ground. I owe you my daughter's life. I owe you everything." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being acknowledged, let alone praised by someone like Richard. "I just did what anyone would have done," he muttered, looking away. "You don't owe me anything." But Richard shook his head, taking a step closer. "No, that's not true," he insisted. "Not everyone would have done what you did, especially after the way I treated you." His voice cracked slightly, and Marcus could see the sincerity in his eyes. This wasn't just a man going through the motions. Richard was genuinely remorseful. "I was wrong," Richard continued, his words coming faster now, as if he feared losing his nerve. "I was so wrong. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I treated you like you were nothing, just because you didn't fit into my narrow view of the world. And because of that, I almost lost the most important person in my life." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I've spent my entire life building this empire, thinking that money and power were all that mattered. But tonight, I realized how empty that all is. My wealth couldn't save my daughter. My influence couldn't protect her. It was you, someone I looked down on, who saved her, and I don't know how to make up for that." Marcus was silent for a moment, letting Richard's words sink in. He could see that the man standing before him was different from the one who had humiliated him just days before. The arrogance, the superiority, it was all gone, replaced by a man who was struggling to come to terms with his own flaws. "You don't need to make up for anything," Marcus said quietly. "Your daughter is safe. That's all that matters." But Richard shook his head again. "It's not enough," he insisted. "I need to do more. I need to change, and I need to start by apologizing. To you." He swallowed hard, his expression one of genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry for the way I treated you. You didn't deserve that. No one does." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Marcus could feel the sincerity in Richard's apology, the depth of his remorse. It was more than just an acknowledgement of wrong. It was a promise to do better, to be better. And as much as Marcus had every right to hold on to his anger, to reject Richard's apology, he found that he couldn't. He had spent too long carrying the weight of the world's indifference on his shoulders. He didn't need to add bitterness to the load. "It's okay," Marcus finally said, his voice soft. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what you do next." Richard looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." There was a moment of silence, a quiet understanding passing between the two men. They were from different worlds, but in that moment, they were equals. Two people who had been changed by the events of the night, bound by a shared experience that neither would ever forget. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the smoldering remains of Richard's home, he turned to Marcus once more. "I want to help you," he said earnestly. "I don't know what I can do, but I want to make things right. I want to help you get back on your feet, to give you the opportunities you deserve." Marcus hesitated, the offer tempting but overwhelming. He had been on his own for so long, surviving on what little he could scrape together, that the idea of accepting help from someone like Richard felt foreign, almost impossible. But as he looked at the man before him, the sincerity in his eyes, Marcus realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go of his pride and accept the help he so desperately needed. "I'll think about it," Marcus finally said, his tone cautious. "But for now, just take care of your family. That's what's important." Richard nodded, understanding the weight of what Marcus was saying. "I will," he promised. "And when you're ready, just know that I'm here to help." With that, Richard extended his hand, a gesture of respect, of friendship. For a moment, Marcus hesitated, unsure if he should take it. But then slowly, he reached out and shook Richard's hand, sealing the unspoken agreement between them. It was a simple gesture, but it carried with it the promise of change, of a future where both men could move forward, free from the shadows of their past mistakes. As they stood there, hand in hand, the first rays of sunlight illuminating the destruction around them, both men knew that this was not the end, but a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, not just homes and lives, but themselves. And in that moment, they both made a silent vow to honor that chance, to make the most of the opportunity that had been given to them. The days following the fire were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The once grand Davenport mansion was now reduced to a charred skeleton, a stark reminder of how quickly life could change. For Richard Davenport, the loss of his home was more than just the destruction of a physical space. It was the end of an era. His life, once defined by luxury, power, and control, had been irrevocably altered in a single night. But as he stood among the ruins of his former life, surrounded by ash and debris, Richard realized that what he had lost paled in comparison to what he had gained. In the aftermath of the fire, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of retreating into the comfort of his wealth, isolating himself from the world as he had always done, he chose to stay in the city, to confront the consequences of his actions head-on. He had spent his life building walls between himself and others, between his wealth and the reality of the world outside his gilded cage. But now, those walls were gone, and Richard was determined to use this opportunity to rebuild, not just his home, but his life. His first step was to reach out to Marcus. After their emotional exchange on the night of the fire, Richard had been struck by the realization that the man he had once dismissed as insignificant was in fact someone he could learn from. Marcus had shown him a kindness and bravery that went far beyond the superficial values Richard had once held dear. He had risked his life to save Richard's daughter, asking for nothing in return. It was a selflessness that Richard had rarely encountered in his world, and it had a profound impact on him. Richard knew that he couldn't simply walk away from this newfound perspective. He needed to understand what had driven Marcus to act as he had, and more importantly, he needed to find a way to repay the man who had given him and his daughter a second chance. With that in mind, Richard sought out Marcus, hoping to forge a connection that went beyond the mere exchange of thanks. It wasn't easy to find Marcus. The man had a way of blending into the background, becoming almost invisible in a city that was all too eager to overlook those who didn't fit into its polished image. But Richard was persistent. He asked around, spoke to people in the community, and eventually he found Marcus at a small shelter on the outskirts of the city where he had been staying since the fire. When Richard arrived, he found Marcus sitting alone in the shelter's courtyard, staring out at the setting sun. There was a calmness about him, a quiet strength that Richard hadn't noticed before. For a moment, Richard hesitated, unsure of how to approach the man who had come to represent everything he had been blind to for so long. But then he took a deep breath and walked forward, determined to begin this new chapter of his life with honesty and humility. "Marcus," Richard called out softly, not wanting to startle him. Marcus turned, his expression unreadable, as he recognized Richard. There was a brief flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly replaced by cautious curiosity. "Mr. Davenport," he greeted, his tone polite but guarded. "What brings you here?" Richard hesitated for a moment, then sat down beside Marcus on the bench. He didn't want to come off as the rich man seeking to absolve his guilt with money or empty promises. He wanted Marcus to understand that this was different, that he was different. "I wanted to see you," Richard began, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what you did for my daughter, for me, and I realize that I can't just walk away from this, from you. I want to understand more about you, about your life, and I want to help, if you'll let me." Marcus was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, thoughtful. "Help? How?" Richard had anticipated this question, but it was still difficult to answer. He had spent so long in a world where help was synonymous with charity, where problems were solved with money, but he knew that wasn't what Marcus needed or wanted. "I don't mean just throwing money at the situation," Richard clarified. "I mean really helping, getting involved, making a difference. I want to learn from you, Marcus. I want to see the world the way you do, and I want to use what I have to make a real impact." There was another pause as Marcus considered Richard's words. He had seen enough broken promises and empty gestures in his life to be wary of any offer, no matter how sincere it seemed. But something in Richard's tone, in the way he held himself, made Marcus believe that this was different. This wasn't the same man who had humiliated him days before. This was someone who had been humbled by life, someone who was genuinely trying to change. "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet. Richard shook his head. "Nothing. I don't want anything from you. I want to work with you. I want to help people, the way you've been helping people. I know I have a lot to learn, and I'm asking if you'll teach me." Marcus looked at Richard, searching his face for any sign of deceit or ulterior motive. But all he saw was a man who was trying to make amends, who was genuinely seeking redemption. It was a rare thing, and Marcus found himself softening, if only slightly. "I don't know how much I can teach you," Marcus admitted. "I'm just trying to get by, like everyone else." "That's exactly why I want to learn from you," Richard insisted. "You know how to survive, how to thrive, even when the odds are against you. You see people, really see them, not just as tools or obstacles, but as human beings. I've been blind to that for so long, but I want to change. I need to change." The sincerity in Richard's voice was undeniable, and Marcus felt his resistance beginning to crumble. He had spent so long on the fringes of society, so long being ignored and dismissed, that the idea of someone like Richard wanting to understand his world was almost incomprehensible. But it was also intriguing and maybe even a little hopeful. Finally, Marcus nodded. "All right," he said slowly. "If you're serious about this, I'll help. But understand this. This isn't about charity. This is about making real change, about doing what's right." Richard smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "That's all I want," he said earnestly. "Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for giving me this chance." From that moment on, Richard and Marcus became unlikely partners, working together to make a difference in the lives of those who had been overlooked by society. Richard used his resources and connections to support initiatives that Marcus had been involved in, from shelters to community programs. But more importantly, Richard took the time to listen, to learn, and to understand the struggles of those less fortunate. He spent hours volunteering, getting to know the people he had once dismissed, hearing their stories, and seeing the world through their eyes. For Marcus, this partnership was transformative in its own way. He had always been independent, always relied on himself to get through life. But now, with Richard's support, he was able to expand his efforts, to reach more people, and to create lasting change in his community. He found himself growing, not just as a person, but as a leader, someone who could inspire others to take action. Together, Richard and Marcus became a force for good in the city, breaking down the barriers that had once separated them and building something new in their place, something based on mutual respect, understanding, and a shared desire to make the world a better place. As the months passed, Richard's mansion was rebuilt, but it was no longer just a symbol of wealth and power. It became a hub of activity, a place where people from all walks of life came together to work on projects that benefited the community. The doors that had once been closed to anyone who didn't belong to Richard's world were now wide open, welcoming anyone who wanted to make a difference. And through it all, Richard and Marcus remained close, their friendship deepening with each passing day. They had both been changed by the events of that fateful night, but in the end, those changes had brought them closer together, creating a bond that neither had expected, but both had come to cherish. Richard's life had been turned upside down, but in the process, he had found something far more valuable than the wealth he had once prized so highly. He had found purpose, connection, and a new perspective on what it meant to truly live. And for Marcus, the experience had reaffirmed his belief in the power of kindness, in the importance of seeing the humanity in others, no matter their circumstances. In the end, both men had been given a second chance, at life, at redemption, and at creating a better world. And they were determined to make the most of it. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more inspiring tales. We'd love to hear what you think. Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts on this story. And if you have any ideas or themes you'd like to see in future stories, share them with us. Your feedback and ideas mean the world to us. See you in the next one.